opportunity. I thank the AAA for this opportunity to present some of my ideas. And I should go back to the beginning of my slideshow. I think you are you on me or? Well, so
you're on.
Great. So what I wanted to do today was sort of do a little brief review of the history of the field, some approaches, paradigms, and some current directions, or at least some directions that I've been taking. And this whole presentation is sort of revolving around one of my long-term pet peeves, which will emerge in the discussion. So, of course, we're always talking about what our favorite ideas are, so that's what I'm going to be doing. Here's the itinerary for our travel today. What is tourism? Present the tourist paradigm versus structural processual approaches, and talk a little bit about mechanical, and then talk a little bit about these two ideas, the impact of tourists and ideologies of travel, and then we'll talk a little bit about what happens after that, after the 90s, different kinds of movements. So in thinking about tourism, conceptualizing tourism, this is something that I think is really fundamental. This was, again, one of my pet peeve areas. So the basic idea of tourism is that there's a tour, and you go away from home, you go to somewhere else, and you may stop along the way and have different kinds of experiences, and then eventually, whether directly, intentionally, or not, you return home again. And so it is this activity of going and returning is done by someone, some persons. And so thus there's a natural and easy way to presuppose that and assume that tourism is what tourists do, right? Tourists, therefore, also create tourism because they do it. They go away, they come back, they travel. But implicit within these two sort of basic tenets of how we think about travel and tourism is that tourism is not travel in general, but a specific subset, right? And so there's, we can get into a little bit of details on that. And then the second thing is that this thinking is rather circular. It's a circular logic of defining tourism through the tourist. And it's the foundational tenets of what I've been calling the tourist paradigm. Wrong next button. Let's see. Tourist paradigm. These two basic principles constitute the tourist paradigm. And first of all, I want to point out that they are a kind of methodological individualism. And this is something that, in fact, McCannell raises long a time ago, and I'll get to a quote about that. But these two ideas, that tourism is what tourists do and tourists create tourism, is popular, pervasive, and perduring understanding of what tourism is. And it leads to a couple of corollaries, three that I've identified. Tourism is not simply travel, but it's a specific set of activities, right? Sightseeing, we can define it in different kinds of ways, and of course that's where theories of tourism have come in, whether within the anthropology of tourism or within interdisciplinary approaches and fields. It also refers to specific kinds of attitudes, motivations, habits, and so on. And again, this is where the structural functionalist and other kinds of approaches have sought to identify these different kinds of attitudes and motivations and goals and so forth, and create theories based on defining these typologies and classifications. But I want to point out here, for example, if we think about some of the anthropologists of tourism who talk about tourism in a way, and they conflate travel in general with tourism. This is a huge problem for me. This is a huge problem because travel is not tourism. Tourism is not travel. We come from the perspective of this tourist paradigm, it's too easy to conflate these two kinds of activities, right? Travel in general, like travel that I conducted in order to get to my house, from my house to here for this activity. Is this tourism or not? Well, this has been some of the areas of debates and discussions, right? And so when we conflate travel and tourism, we're losing something, and this is what I want to point out. Here's a little slide for those of you who are not clear or want some more information about methodological individualism. The first link takes us to its context within the emergence of sociology, and specifically Durkheim's discussion and critique of methodological individualism. And then the second, it has to do with Marx and Weber, their discussion and debate about methodological individualism. And then the last one is its use, which is perhaps the most common and current, so most well known, is it's how methodological individualism is used in the field of economics. Back to the tourist paradigm. So this tourist paradigm emerges in the beginning of the field of studies of anthropology of tourism, and what I have been calling the first wave of anthropology of tourism. And at the end of the slideshow, there's a slide there where a timeline chart where you can see how I differentiate these waves of tourism. This tourist paradigm had reigned supreme for several decades, a good 30, if not at least 20 for sure, at least 30 perhaps more reasonably. It's based on a kind of structural functionalism, but also privileges of methodological individualism. It led to decades of research premised on classifications, as I've identified earlier, and it also leads to endless kinds of debates about what is tourism, how to define it. And the key thing for me about the tourist paradigm is that this paradigm grants the tourist causal agency to create, constitute, and make tourism, to reiterate the point. Also, the new idea here is that what happens is that there's a kind of confusion that happens between the tourist as a role, as an activity, something that is assumed, put on like a suit or a pair of pants and used to go somewhere, and an identity that's much more entrenched, embodied, intrinsic, culturally constructed, yes, of course, but something that has a greater permanence and ontological validity and realism. So opposed to the tourist paradigm is what I've been calling, it's a holistic approach, it's not a paradigm, it's not a singular set of approaches, it's more of an umbrella term, and it refers to a whole variety of different ways of taking a structural and processual approach to tourism. And so tourism is not created by the tourist, but rather tourism is something created sociologically by various other kinds of structures, social processes, political economies, institutions, dynamics within society, but it's not the result of the tourist. What the tourist does and what tourism is actually an effect of these other kinds of processes versus something that comes into existence whole hog. And this becomes very important because as people think about, oh, what's the effect of tourism? What is the impact of tourism? What's the impact of tourists? Then there's this weird misreading, erroneous kind of understanding of what's going on in reality. This is my argument. So McCannell, I think, is a great example illustrating this dynamic between the tourist paradigm and the holistic approaches. And I think that we need to reread McCannell. When I first read McCannell, I hated McCannell, and I was very upset with it. I didn't like it a lot. Now, as my own thinking has matured, I appreciate it much more. And I think it's very important to read and read closely because I think there's a lot of very bad misreadings of McCannell and a lot of misreadings that make it more follow into this tourist paradigm. But one of the things that is very significant about McCannell is that at the very beginning he talks about his Marxism and he talks about his Levi-Straussian structuralism. And these things are very important because it's that context, that reference to those macro processes, those institutional processes, that history of political economy and the emergence of modernity and capitalism, which is really fundamental to understanding what exactly he is saying. And so that is what I would argue is often misread. So if we look, for example, at his discussion of Borstein, he mentions three critiques of Borstein. And the first one is, of course, that he's following a methodological individualistic form of analysis. He says it's insightful, but he undercuts the structural analysis by falling back onto individual level interpretations. He claims that tourists themselves cause these pseudo-events, or what McCannell is theorizing as the staged authenticities, and what we've analyzed in all sorts of different kinds of ways is authenticity and the experience that the tourists have. So that's really important, right? And so the second critique that McCannell makes of Borstein is that Borstein is wrong to argue that tourists do not seek authenticity. They do, and this is very fundamental. This points to that Marxism within Marxist structuralism of McCannell and the holism of his approach, right? It's very crucial because tourists are seeking authenticity because they are allegories. Tourists are allegories for the modern condition of alienation. And this condition of alienation is created, as we know, from the Marxist perspective, by capitalism and modernity. So that's fundamental. That's another point. We can skip that one for brevity's sake. If I can get the tab to move. And so what I really love about McCannell is that very early on in the book he says, the tourist is sometimes a real person. But I'm interested in the idea of the tourist, the figure of the tourist, the role of the tourist. And the role of the tourist is to do these kinds of things that he analyzes, right? The semiotics of reading signs, of having experiences, of seeking authenticity, of getting duped or not duped by the staging of authenticity and these kinds of experiences. And so that's really important for me because too often we forget that. And we forget that what he's saying is sometimes the tourist is a real person. But in this book, he's talking about a trope, an allegorical figure, a sociological role or sociological figure, not real human beings, but who do enact this. And so it's taken us a long time to move away from that kind of understanding. And I think the second wave of tourism studies and anthropologies is initiated in many ways by Ed Bruner's very important work, in which he, at certain points, takes on the role of a tour guide and leads tourists and assumes the role of being a tourist. And he encounters anthropologists being tour guides, being natives, being tourists, and all these kinds of things. And so all that configuration of seeing that, in fact, being a tourist, being on tour, and being an anthropologist is a role. It's not an identity. It's not an ontological state of being. And so what he does, what he allows, and this is the initiation of the second wave of tourism studies, is he breaks from methodological individualism in many ways. Of course, he also breaks from structural functionalism, as he's very much embedded to a kind of interpretivist and symbolic anthropology, narratology. Narrative is very important for him. And so tourism, the tourist is not an ontological identity, but a role. And that, I think, is fundamental that we need to reiterate and think about. And so even if we're interested in the anthropology of tourism, how is it that tourists experience reality, experience what they're doing, we have to understand that there's this shift from what their identity as some kind of sociologically, culturally marked person, class, sex, gender, ethnicity, nationality, religion, language, etc., and then assuming this kind of role, which is of a different kind of status. And that's, I think, one of the huge problems in the anthropology of tourism, is that the differentiation between tourist as role and tourist as a kind of identity in the same degree and quality, which I've been calling ontological, is very important. And we need to be really flesh those things out, separate them out. That's my pet peeve. Quickly, I would just ask you to think about the long-standing debate about the impact of tourism, of tourists. And I ask you to read through narrative histories of not necessarily analytical or sociologically profound analyses of histories, but just read histories of tourism. And you'll see, for example, in these that I've cited here, that there is a long-standing discussion of travelers and their effects on communities, and that there's a negative, long-standing negative viewpoint of the tourist, because they cause bad things on communities. They create changes. And so this idea of the impact of tourism has a long-standing history, and it's also been has a long history of being ideologically valorized. There's a very specific kind of perspective and opinion about the role of tourists on communities. And so what my point here is that what tourists do, what travelers do, what tourism is, what travel does, not travel, but tourism, right? Tourism is the negative version of travel. So what tourism is and what are tourists and what they do has always been ideologically conceptualized. There's no outside of that ideological perspective on what tourism is. And so that's a really important caveat as we, as anthropologists, try to grapple with and figuring out how to study tourism. So there's ideologies of travel, and the ideologies of travel, I've always plugged this book by Justin Stagel, S-T-A-G-L, which is not on the reading list here. It's a book called The History of Curiosity. It's hugely important, I believe. And he points out that from the very beginning with Greeks, there's always been this ideological separation between good travel and bad travel. There's been a moralization. And so we're very familiar with the negative forms of travel: nomadism, the barbarians, vagabonds, homeless wandering. There's no goal. There's no returning home. There's no home to return to. The aliens, the illegal migrants, right, are the contemporary versions of the vagabonds. And so good travel is travel that has a direction, has a goal of self-improvement. It's a technology of self, very clearly. And so the moralization of the traveler is very intrinsic, not only an ideological valorization, but a moral valorization of travel. And the tourist is huge and has thousands of, 2,000 years. It goes back to with the Greeks. So how do we deal with that? We have to be sensitive to that as we think about what is travel and travelers and study tourists and figure out what is our object of study. And so in the 1990s, we have the green movement, and thus the emergence of ecological tourism and the emergence of alternative tourisms to mass consumerism, which are viewed as bad, right? They do all these negative things. It's crass consumerism. It's not having a real experience. They don't really think about authenticity, real people and real cultures, and we know the discourse, right? We're all very familiar with it. And so there's implicit here is a critique of tourism, the critique of the idea of impact. And for me, for those of you who know my work, I've been saying for decades now that the word impact is a four-letter word. I think we need to completely eliminate it from our vocabulary as anthropologists who seek to do serious anthropological analyses or social science analyses of tourism. We must eliminate the whole idea of impact because it implies cultural holes, stasis. It implies this ideas that one thing is affecting another thing. When this tourism is an effect in itself, how can tourism be affecting a community? Rather, the community is creating series of institutions and processes that make tourism, which then appear as if it can, like a ghost, that it can cause something to us. Well, we've created tourism, and the effects that we have sought may not be the ones we like or wanted, but it exists out there as this kind of illusion that is affecting us. So that's my critique of another one of my pet peeves. And also this point of people like Butcher. There's a whole series of tourism scholars in the interdisciplinary field of tourism scholars that are talking about the new moralization of tourism starting from the 1990s. And I would say that actually that's not right. That's incorrect. As I mentioned earlier, ever since biblical times, we've had a moralization of travel. And so what he's identifying, for example, Butcher specifically, is not a moralization, but I would actually say it's an ethicalization of tourism. And so what do I mean by ethicalization? I mean that it is putting the burden of choices and decision-making on the individuals to do things according to their values, ethical values. And so in many ways it's a return to a kind of, it implies a kind of methodological individualism, this kind of ethicalization. And so we have, in fact, this kind of joint thing going on, this ethicalization and a return to methodological individualism. As the industry itself is proliferating two different kinds of tourisms, because there's a market segmentation, and now we're understanding, oh, actually when I teach my summer field school, ethnography field school in Yucatan, Mexico, that's educational tourism. When I take my archaeology field school, when I do my summer field study abroad, or my educational study abroad, all these are different kinds of tourism. When I do missionary work, it's tourism. Of course, missionaries have their own kind of discourse about why their tourism, why what they do is not tourism, right? Just as we used to have in anthropology. What I do as an anthropologist is not tourism. It could not ever be tourism. It's field work, because it's real science. Please don't confuse me with a tourist. Right? So we have a market segmentation and the proliferation of tourisms. And in this context, this proliferation of tourism is all about trying to create a way of traveling that is more ethical according to the individual, so that the individual cannot feel the burden, does not have to feel the burden of guilt of this, which is produced by the ideology, the moralization and ideologies of tourism, so that they don't have to feel all of that, right? And they can just do what they're doing without feeling angst and actually feel good. And so now we have a new kind of moment in neoliberalism, neoliberal globalization, if you wish. It's not my favorite terms, globalization, but we have the emergence of caring capitalism and new kinds of ethical travels and tourisms. And we have, of course, for me, a very problematic thing. The return of this figure of the tourist as an allegory, as a trope for analysis. We confuse causalities in our analyses. We confuse what's going on by reasserting the tourist, by focusing on the tourist as a person, as an ontological being, instead of as a role. We confuse things. This is my fundamental argument. And so we have to understand that the tourist is really an allegory for something. It can be an allegory for lots of different things. For early McCannell, it was the tourist was the allegory of modernity. For later McCannell, it's the allegory of postmodernity. For Zygmunt Bauman, it's the allegory of liquid modernity. And so on and so forth. For the tourist industry, the tourist is the allegory of laissez-faire tourism development. And so here I will end my discussion with the discussion of the Bill of Rights a little bit. In an argument, in a publication I have called The Neoliberal Imperatives, I talk about this. So this is based on that article from a few years back. And so in the Tourist Bill of Rights, we can see that the rights of a tourist in what they do while they're doing what they're doing, traveling, gets converted in the actual text into a neoliberal right to develop tourism without restraint. And so this for me, this is something that so the tourist becomes an allegory of development and this neoliberal right. And the tourist also, for me, becomes an allegory of, or what I'm analyzing the tourist allegory as a kind of notion of universal heir to humanity. And so this is sort of the underlying assumption that allows for this shift from, this slippage from a tourist bill of rights to a neoliberal right to develop tourism. Here's a reference to the tourism rights and Article 7 of this text, the right to tourism. And here we can read it. It's the prospect of direct and personal access to the discovery and enjoyment of the planet's resources. It constitutes a right equally open to all the world's inhabitants. The increasingly extensive participation in national and international tourism should be regarded as one of the best possible expressions of sustained growth of free time. Not of tourism, but of free time, of, back to the technologies itself. This is something we need to develop. And so tourism promoters, Holiday Inn, Delta, pick your Opus Dei, pick your favorite transnational corporate tourism development, they are simply helping us develop our integrity as an ethical human being by developing tourism, by converting beaches into all-inclusive tourist resorts. Well, what they're doing is simply helping us become more ethical as human beings. This is another quote there from section 2. Tourism policies and activities should protect and pass on to future generations. So the one in yellow is perhaps the most key here. So these, we must take care to preserve and upgrade monuments, which must be widely open to tourist visits. Encouragement should be given to public access to privately owned cultural property and monuments. And of course, that's my alarm clock. And of course, it's a very subtle language, but it's there, this kind of mandates to develop. And it's based on the slippage between ethics and rights, and a slippage between the rights of tourists and the rights of promoters and developers and makers. And so what's key here, fundamental in this slippage, of course, is this slippage between the vision of tourism as within the tourist paradigm and tourism from a more holistic kind of approach that assumes that culture, institutions, social processes, structures are prior to and shape tourism, whatever tourism is. And so I think it's very important to think about things like Roman tourism, where some scholars have written about how we are too easily baffled into thinking that that's tourism versus an entirely different kind of cultural construction of travel. Right? And so it's I read these arguments about how Roman tourism is modern tourism. It's just like modern tourism. And it's very persuasive. But we need to pull back and think about what's the key difference there. And the key difference is capitalism, right? So how do we break out of the tourist paradigm? And this is my last point. We pointed out we need to look at carrying capitalism and see how that is a context, an encompassing context and structure, series of processes and histories that are creating certain kinds of markets such that there can seem to be free will, free choice, and that the tourist is making tourism. There's the mobilities paradigm. I'm not particularly fond of it entirely. I think I have a greater predilection towards one of the ideas that it assumed as it developed and took shape, which is the idea of travel and spatial practices, something that I was working on several years ago, based on a Dissertoian model and Dissertoian understanding of travel as a kind of spatial practice and connecting to narratives and the narrative construction of both structures, encompassing structures, and what one is doing. Another kind of theoretical framework that could be very useful to break out of the tourist paradigm, I feel, is Raymond Williams' structures of feeling. And of course, there's the Deleuze and Guattari ideas of strata, flights of escape, flights of tangents that escape the structures, right? And so these are a couple of ideas for theoretical grounding to develop thinking that would escape the tourist paradigm. I think we're still caught in the tourist paradigm, and I advocate, as I suggest to anthropologists and tourists, that we figure out ways and seriously figure out ways to move beyond this approach and not get caught in the tourist paradigm. So we have to ask how to approach tourism. We refuse methodological individualism. We focus on structures and institutions. We use and write histories. We collect historical data in our processes and our ethnographies. And we create historical analyses. And we do not confuse the role of a tourist with an ontological identity. Right? That is, with identity, we don't analyze it. We analyze identity formations, not static representations of persons in this role. So the final point is signaled by this image here, and we cannot ever forget that we are also tourists, and that we are part and parcel of what we're studying when we study tourism. And this image here, in which the tourist is looking back at us, she might very well have been a visual ethnographer. She might very well have been a sociologist, as McCannell suggested, that there's all these tourists running around the world doing tourism and doing sociology at the same time. And so that's all I have to say. Let's see, there's 2 more slides, and again, this is my chronology and some citations. And I'll go back to this. So I can open it up now for any kinds of questions if there's any thoughts. Or...
No, thank you so much. This has been a lot of information in a short amount of time, so I appreciate your thoroughness. But you know, kind of one of the questions that we always like to ask is, for students, especially grad students looking to engage in the study of tourism, kind of where do you have any suggestions of where some programs might be, or kind of just how to engage, maybe even in a non-academic setting as well?
My colleague Naomi Leahy has recently been hired at, oh my goodness, I can't recall the name. The sociology, she's going to kill me because she...
We are recording this.
Yes. She's in England, and actually it's the department, it's called SOAS. And if you go to the Anthropology of Tourism Interest Group, she often posts advertisements for her program in the study of tourism. So that's a very important place. In England, there are several universities that have focus on tourism within an interdisciplinary approach, not necessarily anthropological. And so this place where Naomi Leahy is at, L-E-I-T-E, is significant because it's just she's in charge of an anthropological approach to the study of tourism. My colleague Tim Wallace at North Carolina State University also has been working extensively on tourism. At the University of Maryland, Delaware. There's another very important program there in tourism studies. Those are three that come to the top of my mind, and of course not very adequately, since the names are seeping out of my ear here.
No, thank you. Yeah. So we talked. I don't recall if you actually mentioned the term, but the concept of voluntourism.
Yes, I did mention it. It was written on one of the slides. Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry, that was just one of the questions. But yeah, okay. So yeah, please look back to the slides and you'll get that information on there.
So volunteer tourism. Go ahead.
Oh no. If you want to elaborate on that, I'm trying to see what they were interested in talking about, but yeah.
Yeah, volunteer tourism for me is is an example of one of these alternative tourism. So alternative tourism is a phrase used as an umbrella phrase. It can refer to a whole variety of different kinds of things that are in which the traveler is seeking to do some kind of travel and have some kind of experience that is ethical, that solves or resolves their ethical angst about encountering other human beings in other cultures and having some kind of possibility of some kind of negative effect on them, right? And so it's very much of this, they are different than us kind of mentality. And so volunteer tourism, and there's a variety of different kinds of volunteer tourism. Some people might put missionary work, or specifically short-term missionary work, under the category of volunteer tourism. But all of these in which you go in and offer help, and it could be, short-term because of a disaster, natural disaster. It could be, an established process. It could be service learning. In universities are very much in the business of promoting service learning, study abroad. And so all of those are, for me, a kind of volunteer tourism, even if you pay for it, because some, in fact, you do pay. And all of these are examples of the way in which caring capitalism, neoliberalism in the stage of developing a kind of caring capitalism, retracting from government, trying to have government retract from the market and have corporations insert itself into the public sphere in order to resolve the needs of the society, right? And so as these corporations go in there, they create these various kinds of travel experiences, volunteer tourism, missions, short-term missionary work, disaster travel, aid, service learning, and so on. So I put all that kind of volunteer tourism. My colleague Mary Mustafa Nasheed at the University of Hawaii has written one book on ethnography and has co-edited another volume. David Picard is also involved with issues, not exactly, well, you might wonder, I'm linking him. He's actually been working on couch surfing, and so I link that also with volunteer tourism, right? It's an attempt to do tourism in a way that's more ethical. David Picard on couch surfing. Let's see, whom else? So all of these also point in the direction of another kind of concept, which is cosmopolitanism. And so the discourse on cosmopolitanism, of course, goes back to Kant, and there's sort of revisionisms of that. And in anthropology, it has had a couple of different turns from its initial insertion into the anthropological discussion. I also would point out my colleague Margaret Peg Swain, who's been working on ideas of cosmopolitanism in a way that shifts the idea of cosmopolitanism from the traveler to the communities and their experience of cosmopolitanism. And I am trying in my own work, research in the field school that I conduct in Mexico, trying to take some of her ideas and think about cosmopolitanism not as something that is an attribute of the traveler, but as an attribute and something to debate and discuss and analyze for the community itself. I don't know if that...
Yeah, no, thank you. Again, very thorough. Yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think we can actually wrap up a little early today, unless anyone has any further pressing. Obviously, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for your time.
Fantastic, incredibly informative. And I think just as a few house cleaning notes, we will be taking a break next month in November. Obviously, the annual meeting. It's kind of like a giant webinar, I like to think of it that way. But then we should be returning in December with 2 to wrap up the end of the year. So please stay tuned for that. And yeah, it looks like you've answered every question possible on positive tourism. So we're good to go. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much, Andrew, and the rest of us who came. Thank you so much for being in attendance. I hope it was useful for you.
All right.
Feel free to contact me if you'd like to continue discussion.
All right. So yeah, definitely. Send any emails to the AAA account, AAA meetings at AAA, or I'm sorry, we just switched over our server. So it's AAA meetings at americananthro.org, and then I'll happily forward them on.
Super.
But yeah, all right.
Okay, thank you.